Hi, my name is Elishka Pierce, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about farm pollution and the Clean Water Act. So to begin, just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. We'll start with CAFO pollution, go into the Clean Water Act, look at a specific case involving the Clean Water Act, then go into a proposed amendment to the Act, and then lastly, look at some environmental justice and ethical obligation considerations. So first, CAFO stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. These are very prevalent in the Midwest. However, they pose a very significant environmental hazard, particularly to water quality. So the USDA predicts or estimates that they create 1.4 billion tons of manure annually. And as you can see here on the right, the manure is stored in these pond lagoon-like places and can be really harmful to the environment when it rains heavily. Because then it can cause this manure to run off into the environment, into free-flowing water sources, and affect drinking water. This can also affect groundwater because when they sit in ponds like this, it can leach into the groundwater and affect that quality as well. And so this is particularly harmful because manure contains E. coli, antibiotics, viruses, growth hormones, and many other substances that we do not want in our water or in our ecosystems. And this is related to the Clean Water Act because the Clean Water Act labels CAFOs as point source polluters. So with this, they must ask for permits before they can begin their operations as long as they are polluting. So this means they need to monitor, report, and limit their pollutants. And also, as I mentioned before, groundwater pollution is a problem. However, this act states that groundwater regulation is only case by case. And this is important to think about when going into this court case here. So Food and Water Watch versus US EPA is a case that happened last year. And essentially, the Idaho CAFOs asked the EPA for a permit. And prior to this, the Idaho EPA had published a study saying that they found high levels of E. coli in local drinking water, and they had traced this back to CAFOs in particular. However, the US EPA published a draft fact sheet saying all of these things and allowed for public comment. And months later, they issued the permit to Idaho. However, very soon after, Food and Water Watch petitioned against this, saying they had an issue with two main things. One being that the monitoring process, just generally of the pollution runoff, was too intangible. And so it would be very hard for farmers to fully comply with these regulations. And so they would be broken anyways. And the second being that there was no groundwater regulation or monitoring included in the plan, although it was something, like I mentioned before, that's very important to monitor. And so at the end, the court agreed that the EPA needed to revise this plan and include groundwater regulation and to make monitoring something that is easy to comply with and standards can actually be met. So this, the Clean Water Act, in terms of regulating manure and contamination of water in that sense, is a good first step. But as we continue with agriculture, we see that groundwater contamination is an issue. And so kind of brings up the question of, is the Clean Water Act sufficiently addressing the CAFO pollution issue? And my argument is that no, the Clean Water Act, because it is not sufficiently meeting the needs of water contamination, that it should require all CAFO permits to regulate groundwater and the subsequent leaching. And so when we look at issue of water contamination and ask whether or not the regulations are sufficient, it's really important to consider how it affects all communities, which in fact, it doesn't necessarily affect all communities and disproportionately affects marginalized groups and areas. And so the goal with this amendment would be to bring in their voices when CAFO proposals are being made, asking, is this a fair location? Are the effects going to be overwhelmingly felt in low-income neighborhoods and things of that sort? And be able to decide before the project is even made whether or not this is going to be something that is extremely harmful to one group over another. And so with that opinion also comes adding in their voices with the EPA permits as well. And so asking them, is this something actually that's being useful? Are you still seeing impact in your communities from pollution? Are the regulations not strict enough? Things like that. And so we give them a platform that acts as a participative justice action that could therefore increase distributive justice as well, in that the concentration of harm isn't necessarily just on this group, but it's more the spread or not necessarily felt as deeply by one group. And so when we're considering environmental justice and impacts on humans, we also have to look at, of course, the environmental obligations we have to the environment ourselves. And so Aldo Leopold essentially says that our duty is to maintain the integrity, complexity, and health of ecosystems. And not only are we supposed to maintain this complexity, but there is this interdependence between relationships in an ecosystem that are critical to its functioning. And these are something that have inherent worth and are necessary for us to protect and to assure that we are not destroying, because these are things that we cannot get back. In addition to this, Robin Kimmer tells us that Earth is a gift. It is something that we also must protect and restore, not only protect, but to take care of for future generations to enjoy and to love and to also have their families in as well. And so our environmental obligations essentially are to maintain to maintain the health of the ecosystem before we begin adding contaminants and all these other things into it, and to ensure that it's functioning at its optimal level and that we are not dampening its functioning by adding pollutants such as manure runoff. And so in conclusion, the Clean Water Act needs to be amended both for environmental justice and our environmental obligations in order to uphold an equal standard across the nation, so that one CAFO isn't harming a community more than another. It needs to be a cut and dry standard across the nation, and also to protect our drinking water that affects our health, also affects the ecosystem's health. And like I said before, this is an obligation. The environment has worth, and we need to take care of it. Thank you, and that is all.